Namaskar, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. In the run-up to the Union Budget 2022, we've been focusing on specific sectors of the economy, their performance, and going forth, their expectations from Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. Today, we will talk about the banking sector, which, like various other sectors, has shown signs of recovery. Bank credits have increased from 6% in 2020-21 to 7.3% in 2021-22, though bank deposits have reduced from 11.3% in 2020-21 to 9.6% in 2021-22. Pursuant to the government's 4R strategy of recognition, resolution, recapitalisation and reforms, non-performing assets, the NPAs of the banking sector have declined to nearly 8.5 lakh crore as on 31st March 2021. As per the Financial Stability Report released by the Reserve Bank of India in July 2021, macro stress tests on the basis of regression modelling indicate that the GNPA, which is the gross non-performing asset ratio of scheduled commercial banks, under the baseline scenario may increase from 7.48% in March 2021 to 9.8% by March 2022. Also, the net profit of public sector banks, the PSBs, surged over 14,000 crore rupees in the first quarter and further went up to more than 17,000 crore rupees in the second quarter, which ended September 2021. Similarly, private sector banks, including HDFC, ICICI and Kotak Mahindra banks, also posted healthy profit with reduction in bad loans. So experts say timely government action, quick adaptability of the banking industry, in conjunction with the power of technology, have set the base for credit growth improvement in the coming year as well. So on the cusp of recovery, how does the outlook look like for the sector in the coming financial year? How will the banking sector contribute to the country's expanding economy? And for this, what are the expectations and hopes from the upcoming budget? What are the impending reforms in the banking sector that the new financial year may bring about? These are some of the aspects we will discuss on the program today with three distinguished panelists who are joining me. So let me first introduce them to you. I have the pleasure of welcoming on the program today Mr. C.M. Vasudev, former Finance Secretary, Dr. Charan Singh, former Chairman, Punjab and Sindh Bank, and Mr. Bikash Narayan Mishra, Senior Advisor, Indian Banks Association. So before we begin talking about reforms in the banking sector and also, the outlook for this sector in the coming year, Mr. Mishra, let me come to you for the first word on the expectations, the hopes, the Indian Banks Association's wish list from the upcoming budget.
Yeah, when we talk about the reforms, see, it dates back to the 90s in the last century. Based on the Narasimhan Committee report, a lot of reforms have taken place, and then more particularly in the last 5 years, the reforms that have happened, we didn't have a strong recovery law. So with the IBC, that is Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and after that we have NCLT and IBBI. So this has given a new direction to the recovery system in the country, and that our experience with this IBC has been quite rewarding in as much as many of the cases are being now expeditiously getting resolved. But then when you talk about the expectations, we have made a beginning in the last year budget. There was provisions for a NARCL, that is the bad bank. Then we also had provision for the IDRCL, Indian Debt Resolutions Company. Then NAFID, National Bank for Financing Infrastructure and Development. Now it is expected that all these three pioneer institutes, which are expected to deliver, in the near future, they should start functioning, and it is. I'm sure the NARCL and IDRCL are the very final stage of and getting. It is set up and it will start working maybe in a couple of months' time, and that will give a new direction to resolution of the bad debt. And as you also said in the beginning, in the last year, the public sector banks and the banking sector as a whole you can see some silver linings in as much as the GNPA that was as high as 11.5% in March 18, that has come down to 6.9% in the September 21, and all the public sector banks for the first time they have come out with profit in the first time in the last 5 years. So the things have started moving And I think we have better days ahead, and the banking sector will continue to contribute towards the growth of the economy in a better way in the times to come.
Absolutely. Dr. Singh, what are your hopes from Nirmala Sitharaman's budget? Last year, we heard there were several big ticket announcements as far as the banking sector was concerned. We are still amidst the pandemic. So looking at that, how feasible, what are the kind of announcements that you would expect her to make for the banking and the financial sector?
My own views are that, yes, the public sector banks, I have always held that view, are as competent or better than the private sector banks. And the results have started to show that the public sector banks' performance has started improving despite being in the crisis of COVID and recovering from the COVID. So that is something which is very positive. But I am also of the view that the banks' nationalization that took place in 1969 and 1980 are not for the altruistic purpose, only for the altruistic purpose of banking penetration in the rural areas. I would like to invite you to read that speech by Dr. Y.V. Reddy, former governor of the RBI, who clearly mentions that there were many other purposes why nationalization took place. The very fact that I'm referring to this is clearly pointing that I'm of the view that the government should generally not be in commercial entities. Commercial entities should be left to the private sector to run them, earn profit from them. Now, the government had announced in the last budget that they'll be looking for privatization of banks, and I feel that the government should pursue it and go ahead with privatization of a few commercial banks. Before that, the government had already gone in strengthening the 5 banks. There were quite a few mergers that took place, and those 5 banks have started showing positive results, which is very encouraging. But as the government's policy was, and as Narasimhan Committee had also mentioned way back in mid-90s, that the country needs a few long and big commercial banks. So State Bank of India has a long history. Bank of Baroda has a long history. So they're very traditional. That's very good. But then other banks need to get into the private sector because there is no reason that the government should bear the cost of running these banks. Also, when the banks are in the private sector, the management of the banks, the governance of the banks changes, the job security changes, and therefore the performance of the bank improves automatically. I think that agenda of the government should continue, and I look forward to the government stressing that they will continue with the efforts to privatize some of the public sector banks.
Okay. Dr. Vasudev, do you also think, because privatization, we all know, has been one big ticket reform that is being talked about, the government has also spelled out its agenda, although no timeline has been given as to when things will begin to proceed. Do you expect the Finance Minister to make any announcement related to that in her upcoming budget?
You know, when you consider the banking sector in the context of the budget formulation, you have to keep in mind a couple of things. One, of course, is that the banking sector is a financial intermediary sector. It takes money from the savers of society and can give it to the users of society. So, which means that the health of the banking sector is intimately connected with the health of the real sector. And we all know that the real sector of the economy was particularly hard hit last year because of the economy was battling with COVID-related issues. So obviously the banking sector could not remain unaffected. That was one background. Second is also that when you talk about banking sector changes or reforms or improvements, there is the regulatory aspect, which are in the purview of the Reserve Bank of India, which they are doing based on Narasimhan Committee and other committee reports like income recognition, capital adequacy, asset classification. All those reforms have been done by the regulator, the Reserve Bank of India, which it is fine-tuning in keeping with the best practices as they are emerging globally and as our economy is changing. So where does the role of the government or the budget come in respect of the banking sector? In 2 areas to my mind. One, in respect of the public sector banks, because the government is the owner. So how to reform, how to make them more efficient. The point that you have made, I'll just come to that. And the second is how to create some institutional mechanisms or legislative changes which can help in better functioning of the banking sector, in which context things like the IBC, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, the debt recovery tribunals, and other legal framework changes that have been made. So they form part of the government's role, which of course the budget can bring forward more changes in that direction or make improvements in that. Now, insofar as the public sector banks reforms is concerned, I think the roadmap that the government has laid out over the last 2-3 years is pretty clear. They have tried to consolidate public sector banks into larger banks. So some banks have been merged together. The State Bank of India and its subsidiaries have been merged together. And you have to see how these are going to move forward. But the big announcement in the last year's budget that they want to take it forward and they want to privatize 2 public sector banks, which is a very big thing. But the starting point for that has to be amendment in the Bank Nationalization Act, because under the Bank Nationalization Act, government shareholding in public sector banks cannot be less than 51%. Now, the last budget had announced that the government will try to bring it down to 26%. This will require a major legislative change. So what I would like to see in this budget, how this is going to be taken forward. Are we going to see an amendment in the Bank Nationalization Act as part of the finance bill, which will be a very great thing? And only if that is done can the next step of privatizing the 2 public sector banks that they have announced, that can follow. Because without that amendment, that cannot happen. So that is something which we have to watch for in the budget, how the finance minister is going to deal with implementation of last year's announcement. 1 year has passed. During this 1 year, they should have come forward with the amendment in the Bank Nationalization Act, which has not come forward. So we have to see whether they're going to do it as part of the finance bill this year. Second is banks like IDBI, which are not really covered by the Bank Nationalization Act because majority shareholding is held by the LIC and they are not creatures of the Bank Nationalization Act, the IDBI. So whether the privatization of IDBI will happen, which is much easier to do as compared to public sector banks, because there I think 98% or so shareholding is jointly held between LIC and the government of India. So that should be relatively easier for them to do, how they're going to do it. And thirdly, I think it is the political headwinds that the government has to tackle in dealing with this very basic reform of privatizing public sector banks. Whether in the context of the election season and various other things, whether the government will have the political will to go ahead and make that amendment, because the unions in the banking sector are pretty strong. The union in the public sector banks, especially the nationalized banks, unions are pretty strong. And they've already flexed their muscles a couple of times, and they have not taken this announcement of privatizing 2 public sector banks very kindly. So we have to see how the finance minister deals with this. So that is the other aspect I would like to see. Another aspect I would like to see is with regard to the cooperative banks, about which also an announcement was made last time, that the cooperative banks, of course, the duality in regulatory control has been corrected. Now, RBI is the regulator. Earlier, the registrars of cooperative societies and all, there was a duality of regulations. But that has been taken care of. But the other next step of converting these cooperative banks into creatures of company law, that is another thing which one has to look forward to, because cooperative banks, I think, they don't have a history of very efficient banking system. They are not very efficient intermediaries. There have been a lot of cases of frauds and things of that type. So that is another area which is crying for reform. So we have to see whether the government is in a position to bite the bullet in that area.
Absolutely. How the finance ministry deals with it in the coming days, we'll have to wait and watch. Mr. Mishra, a number of significant points raised by Mr. Vasudev on how the privatization aspect is going to be taken forward by the government. What are your views on privatization, and particularly looking at the turnaround that the public sector banks have made in the last year? Do you think privatization is the only way ahead, or is there an alternative to this?
See, privatization, there is no harm in trying privatization. The government is trying privatization in all the sectors. So there is no harm in trying this in the banking sector also. And as Sir was telling, the legislations could be, I don't think legislation could be an issue, because once the government has the kind of majority, so legislation is also possible. But my submission is that, you see, privatization as such is perhaps not the solution in the banking industry. It's not a kind of panacea, I will say, because we are a transitional society and we need both strong public sector banks and also strong private sector banks. The strong public sector banks will look after both the social banking aspect and also commercial part, and the private sector banks focus on commercial part. And as you will, in the last 5 years, you will see there have been three major, what you call, events that have happened. One is the Jan Dhan program of 2014, where the public sector banks carried out the Jan Dhan program to the extent of 97%. Then it was followed by the 2016 demonetizations. There also it was the public sector bank who took the lead to come to the rescue of the general public who came to exchange their notes. And third is the pandemic time. Again, the public sector banks were opened throughout the country, which to ensure that the what you call the direct benefit transfer doesn't get affected, the common man doesn't get affected for the basic banking services. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to social banking, and more so in a traditional economy, traditional society that we are, for the last 70 years we have been there, and maybe for another 25 years or so we'll continue to be in that status. And in a country when we have still 65% of our population in rural areas, because in the last, you will say, from 1951 till now, so we are the rural population is coming down by at least 2% or 2.5% per decade. So maybe in 2050 also we'll have 60% of our people still living in the rural areas, and there are 6,38,000 villages in this country. So although the per branch population has come down from 65,000 at the time of nationalizations to now maybe 9,000, but it is not uniform. In the rural area, maybe one rural branch is serving around 20,000 people still now. So I don't think private banks will go to those areas where it is not as viable as in the urban areas and so. Okay. And as Charan Singh sir was also telling, we are a country, we're a great nation. We have a 250 years of banking history. But even now, we have only 3 banks, which are ranked as in the first 100 banks in globally. Mm-hmm. And there are only 23 banks which are ranked in the first 1,000 banks globally. So we have a long way to go so far as taking the lead globally is concerned. We have only 126 branches present which are serving in foreign countries, whereas there are 43 banks, foreign banks are serving here with more than 260 branches. Okay, so these are the gaps. And I think the government has the right intention, and they have started implementing. The last 5 years have seen many changes in the area of recovery by capitalizing the bank.
Okay, going forth, how can we fill these gaps is something that I'll come to you, Mr. Vasudev. But since we are also talking about reforms and looking forth the expectations of the budget, one of the important aspects that was announced, Dr. Charan Singh, in the last budget was the announcement by the Finance Minister on bad banks. 1 year forth, we haven't seen any movement on that proposal. Do you see the Finance Minister building it up? And what actually ails the proposal? Why has there been no movement on the aspect of bad banks, which came up with a very good objective?
Well, I agree with what you were saying, that the Finance Minister did mention that they would be building the bad banks, and many banks were very excited about that very fact, that there will be movement and there you can clean the balance sheet and that banks takes over. These things take time, and I think as you have just seen, between Mr. Vasudev and Mr. Mishra, there are doubts on privatization. Whereas in my own mind, I'm very clear that in a country of India's size and dimension, public sector banks have probably served their purpose. They have done a great job, as was mentioned, even including in opening the Jan Dhan accounts, also banking penetration. But then the paradigm has shifted. Now we have Jam Trinity. In the Jam Trinity, and before that, we had the business correspondents. In the changing environment, I really do not see the need for a brick and mortar branch. And therefore, I keep saying that technology has a far bigger role to play in banking than the brick and mortar branch. And therefore, privatization is one way one can move ahead. The other thing that I want to mention here clearly is that, yes, the public sector banks do play a role in social banking. But then, with the competition increasing and the private sector banks doing also a good job, we just cannot say that the present existing public sector banks joining in the private sector will not continue to do the good job. They will continue to do the good job. But the important thing is that as a matter of principle, as I have seen in this government, they believe that commercial enterprises, like they did with the Tata, with the Air India into Tatas, commercial enterprises should be run by the private sector. And the government should do its basic functions of things which private sector cannot do. The last point I want to make is, if we are looking for a $5 trillion economy, the private sector has to shoulder far greater responsibility. And therefore, banking is also that responsibility that the private sector should come forward and say, look, if these are the objectives of banking, as Mr. Vasudeva was saying, that you have to take deposits and lend, and there has to be responsibility, risk management while doing that job of intermediation, the private sector can do it too. Okay. So therefore, these things do take time. And connecting with the bad bank issue, as you see, there is a thought process in the country which started long time ago with the consolidation of banks, that there needs to be some reforms in the public sector banking system and the total banking system in the country. Similarly, the bad bank idea was entertained. But I must mention that government's initiatives, and this is a bad year to start a new initiative, but the government's initiatives in general, including the IBC, has generally helped the public sector banks to recover and clean their balance sheets. So to that extent, even if there's a delay in the bad bank, doesn't mean that the public sector banks have suffered. The public sector banks continue to do well. And as you mentioned yourself, and we all know it, there's a far better performance in the public sector banks, improvement in their asset quality, in their risk management. So nothing I would say awkward has happened if there has been a genuine delay. And I call it a
Mr. Vasudev, although Dr. Singh has already made that point on, what Mr. Mishra said, the gaps that persist in terms of reach and accessibility of public sector banks, which the private sector banks will not be able to match. But what is the point that you wanted to make? And the second point, since we're talking about reforms, apart from privatization, what are the other impending reforms in the Indian banking sector?
Well, the point I wanted to make was that when we talk about public sector banks and private sector banks, this is a very hackneyed sort of an argument that there is a lot of social responsibility and penetration of banking in rural areas. All that, we have crossed that path. I think banking has penetrated a lot, and you've got Jan Dhan accounts for everybody. Private sector banks have gone into rural areas and all that. So I think we really have to consider the efficiency argument more important, because, as I said, banks are an intermediary sector. So the efficiency of the intermediary intimately affects the efficiency of the real sector, as does the other way around. If the real sector is inefficient, the banking sector cannot be efficient. Similarly, if the banking sector is inefficient, the real sector will not be as efficient as it can be. Mm-hmm. So we have to view this argument of public versus private sector banks, or privatization of public sector banks, from the point of view of the efficiency of operations of the banks alone. And there, I think all indicators of whether you take profitability and various other things, despite so much comfort of government ownership, you see that the efficiency of the private sector banks is much better than that of the public sector bank. Okay. Of course, it is granted that public sector banks have done a lot of social obligations by going into unbanked areas and less commercial operations and all that, but all that has happened. And as I think the previous speaker very rightly said, that there was a time for that type of activity, and we are now in a different stage of the economy. So in the current situation, the private sector banks are not in a position to compete on efficiency considerations with the private sector banks. So we have to look for ways to improve the efficiency. Now, of course, people are the same. They're very efficient. I've seen very good managers, managing directors and all senior personnel in the public sector banks, but it is not that. It is the same people when they go to the private sector banks, and a lot of these private sector banks like HDFC Bank, ICICI Bank have benefited from people moving from public sector banks, but it is the ownership of the government which really impacts, which really constrains their efficiency and restricts their freedom to do things in a commercial way. And there are things like CVC and CBI inquiries. And so public sector managers are very risk averse as a result of all that. And same managers, when they go to a private bank, are not risk averse at all. So these are the issues which are coming out of that. So one should not see the debate between public and private sector bank in that sense. We should really focus on the efficiency.
Okay, looking towards the future, Professor Singh, coming back to you, digital is the future, and we need to strengthen the digital infrastructure, particularly looking at the role the cooperative banks play. What is the way forward to have a more inclusive financial system?
Exactly. That's the point I wanted to make. And you were asking from the budget angle. Look, the country is almost on the verge of now recovering from the various waves of COVID. We have to look forward. The world is on a reset button. And I think in a developing phase, an emerging country that India is, banking will continue to play a very prominent role, at least for next 10 years. Therefore, and as Mr. Vasudev rightly said, the cooperative banks have come under the regulation of the Reserve Bank. Therefore, we need a third Narasimhan committee now. That means we need a roadmap to come up and say that in the changing paradigm of the banking system, including digital, including jam Trinity, internet banking, type of technological advances, some of the ones we are first in the world that we have made. What is the role that the public sector, private sector, small banks, payment banks, and cooperative banks, including NBFCs, and they are also important because they serve the last leg in the banking system, reaching those places where public and private sector foreign banks don't reach. What will be the role that each one of them will play? And looking at the country which the Prime Minister says he wants a $5 trillion and a $10 trillion economy, I think time is due now. 25 years back, we had Narasimhan 2. I think time is due now to have the third Narasimhan and say, here is a roadmap for the banking industry to make India a $5 or a $10 trillion economy.
And certainly to have the banking sector contribute more towards this expansion of the economy. All of these reforms, all of these ways looking ahead are very, very important. Time is running out. I'll have to wind up the discussion on that note from Dr. Singh. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me on the program today, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. It was a pleasure having you on the show. So that's it from us on this edition of Perspective today. Thanks very much to all our viewers as well for their time.